So I'm going to give some of my thoughts on these written and visual sources about men and women in Rome. I'm going to start off by looking at the legendary stories of Rome. And I think these are really interesting in terms of giving us an insight into what the Romans have kind of grown up with, the stories that they've heard told to them throughout the generations, and so it gives us a kind of almost like an established idea of some of the kind of key ideals, key conduct. What's good behavior, bad behavior, and attitudes towards men and women, and also expectations of men and women and their status. So the sources one and two were produced by Livy, who was a historian um, writing in the first century BC, and he took it upon himself to write the whole history of Rome, going right back to the founding of Rome and by Romulus um, and Remus, and the story of how Romulus was the first king of Rome. And so these first two sources are taken from that earlier period. The story about the Sabine women involves Romulus himself. So we're talking about 753 BC. Um, and I think it has some interesting insights into attitudes towards women and their role and expectations of women, but also the behavior of men and what seems to be acceptable and not acceptable. So there's a few things I'd like to draw your attention to. The first one is if we have a look at um, the the line which talks about um, the Romulus sending an envoy to all nearby nations. So he's trying to populate Rome. He's founded Rome. He now needs to populate Rome, and currently only has men, seemingly in Rome. And so at first he uses diplomatic means in order to try and arrange marriages with the neighboring tribes, and so he sends envoys to all the neighboring tribes, including the Sabine tribe, and actually asks them for an alliance and for intermarriage with his new state. So it's the establishment of the Roman state here that we've got. However, the other tribes are not having any of it. Um, and um, so this then means that um, Romulus Romulus's first idea, he has to now change his tack. He has to change his plan, and so he after trying diplomacy, which doesn't work, he then has to use force and trickery. Um, it's also interesting to note here this line where it says, talking about Romulus and the men of Rome at that time, they were confident that the origins of Rome were supported by the gods and would not lack virtue, so that their neighbours would not be unwilling to mix their blood with that of the Roman race. So, this idea that the gods must be supporting them, and therefore that justifies any behaviour from the Romans. They believe that it's fate, and they have the backing of the gods. So therefore, they now need to resort to other means. So he devises a plan, Romulus, and he decides to trick the neighboring towns and invites them to attend a religious festival. So under the guise of hospitality and also a religious festival, he then manages to lure these different tribes, and the Sabine tribes happen to come with, as it says here, with all their people, including their wives and their children. Um, and Romulus sees this as an opportunity to attack. And I think another key part of this source is this line, pre-planned attack. And I think it's interesting to get an insight into men, that the fact that he's acting in a or it seems to be okay that a man is acting with force. And it's very militaristic language here being used by Livy. And it certainly is force when we look at some of the other languages. The other language, the young Romans rushed in to carry off the maidens. For the most part, the men snatched those who happened to be in their paths. And so these men, violently take these women, these young maidens, against the will and from their families. Um, Other things to note, of course, in terms of what is Livy is kind of highlighting about these women, these young women, is their that beauty, and seems to single out some of them. So those with beauty um, and who carry themselves well, have good demeanor, are taken off to give to the patrician classes, to the more noble classes. And one of these was a man called Thalassius. Um, and this actually even manages to make its way into Roman marriage ceremonies. There's a call, O Thalasso, um, that's part of the Roman marriage ceremony that actually then that is then practiced, for hundreds of years to come. That refers right back to this one of these founding stories, and to this to the abduction of these women. So so I think that's quite interesting to note, that that's where the wedding cry originated. We've got etiology here, kind of origins of customs for the Romans. Another thing that's significant in this passage is where the Sabines are accusing the Romans of the crime of violating hospitality, and so they invoke the gods. Um, they don't seem to have a problem here, or at least Livy doesn't mention it, that the crime is that their daughters have been taken. It's more the fact that they've violated hospitality. They've kind of broken that kind of guest friendship. And so I think that's interesting to consider when we're thinking about, actually the role of women here. Um, so the injustice seems to be more with the fact that the gods might have been offended, and that the hospitality has been broken. Um, However, Romulus then, to kind of appease the Sabine parents, and to appease the women, goes to the maidens and says, that um, you will be married, so, and you will then share in the possessions of the Roman people. So you will then become a part of the Roman state. You will be given citizenship, and then the other reward, of course, the dearest pleasure of the human race, their children. So he is telling the women that these are the rewards that they can, by marrying their abductors, they will be better off for it, because they will become citizens and they will have children. And I think that's quite interesting, thinking about the lot of women, and what's expected for them. Um, the other thing is, the way that Livy writes his history. It's interesting here in this section where he starts talking about how over time these husbands and wives started to become more affectionate. Um, they would soften their anger and give their hearts to the men whom fortune had given their bodies. And so they'd often find their husbands gentler. Um, and so this idea that women might be easily placated, easily softened, by men being affectionate towards them, by them charming them. um, which is the most effective way of appealing to a woman's heart, says Livy. Um, However, there's still a kind of implication when it says they would find their husbands gentler. That seems to imply that obviously they've been forceful or violent before. So, yeah, this story really tells us that the women here, these young women, really didn't have a choice in the matter. However, in 1.13, um, Livy then goes on to, I think this section of the story is the most amazing because um, the what happens is that the Sabine fathers and come together to fight against the Romans, and so there is a war and between the Sabines and the Romans, and also some of the other um, nearby tribes as well against the Romans. And in the end, it's actually the women, the daughters of these Sabines, who have been abducted. They're the ones who have had this done to them. However, they're the ones who actually bring peace in the end. And so we get these, we see them um, go run into battle itself. They dared to take themselves amongst the flying missiles with torn clothes and streaming hair, their feminine fear overcome by their misfortune. And they appeal, it's the women who have to appeal to their fathers, and they also have to appeal to their husbands. And so I think this is interesting because it shows, going right back to the early stories, that women are beholden to men and they have to appeal to their fathers or their husbands. They are the key people in their lives that control their lives. And but it's through their ideal behavior by kind of they then take on the blame for it. Um, they ask them to turn your anger against us. We are the cause of war, of wounds, and of the deaths of our husbands and fathers, which is an amazing statement to make. So here Livy is kind of representing these women as kind of um, almost responsible, and that they'd rather die than to live as widows or orphans without you. There seems to be this sense that women are completely, um, uh, you know, um, lost without men. And so, in the end, this has an impact. Their pleas, their supplications towards their fathers and to their husbands brings about this alliance. And so, I think you can see this in two ways. One is in a negative light because obviously it shows how um, under the thumb they are. The fact their lives are completely linked with their fathers and their husbands. Or you could look at it in a more positive way and kind of think about the strength of women being shown right in the early stories. And it's interesting to note that in the end, these women, their ideal conduct, their ideal behaviour is is then rewarded um, by um, by um, by the Romans. Um, the Sabine people they come together with Romulus. They join together, so the two nations become one. Um, and the last few lines talks about when Romulus divided the people into 30 curiae. Curiae is a council, and these curiae, were established and have continued into Roman history. And he named each curia after one of the women, supposedly. So here, the women are remembered um, in times to come for the great um, kind of role they had in the establishment of the Roman um, state.